Have you ever walked away from a conversation thinking, did that person just disrespect me? Maybe it was subtle, a smirk, a joke wrapped in sarcasm, an innocent interruption. Or maybe it was direct, dismissive tone, eye-rolling, condescending questions. Either way, it left you questioning yourself, second-guessing your worth, wondering if maybe you were just being too sensitive.
Let me stop you right there. You're not too sensitive. You're awake.
You're noticing what most people have been trained to ignore. The quiet ways people test your boundaries. The truth is, we live in a world where disrespect often hides behind smiles, where people project their insecurities onto others and call it just being real. And for far too long, you've probably been told to brush it off, to stay polite, to not rock the boat. But what if I told you that not reacting could be the most powerful reaction of all? What if you didn't have to yell, argue, or prove anything to anyone? What if your very presence, calm, grounded, untouchable, was enough to shift the room? That's exactly what the ancient Stoics understood. They didn't fight for respect, they embodied it. They didn't beg for boundaries, they became the boundary. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to do the same. These aren't your typical self-help tips. These are battle-tested strategies. Quiet, firm, deeply rooted in ancient wisdom. 6 Stoic ways to handle people who don't respect you, without ever losing your cool, and without ever giving away your power. And here's the thing. By the end of this video, you'll stop asking, why are they treating me like this? Instead, you'll start saying, they don't get access to me anymore. So stay with me. What you're about to learn might just change how you show up in every conversation from this point forward. Let's begin. Part 1. Master the silent gaze. Let stillness speak for you. It happened again. You were in the middle of speaking, maybe in a meeting, maybe over dinner, and they cut you off. Not once, not twice. Over and over they interrupt, talk louder, lean forward like your voice was just background noise. You pause, politely, thinking maybe it was accidental. But then it happens again. They dismiss your words with a joke, a smirk, or that tone. The one that says, you don't matter here. And you feel it, not just in your mind, but in your body. That tightness in your chest. That quiet burn in your stomach. That instinct to explain yourself, to speak faster, to prove you belong. But this time, you don't do any of that. This time, you lean back. You stop speaking. You lift your eyes, and you look at them, calm, steady, unshaken. You don't smile. You don't blink. You don't react. You just look. And the silence that follows is louder than anything you could have said. That's the moment the dynamic shifts. Because people who disrespect others usually do it for the same reason. Control. They're not always conscious of it, but they interrupt, belittle, or mock because they're seeking a reaction. They want to see you flustered. They want to knock you off balance, and most of all, they want to confirm that they can. But when you meet that behavior with presence, with silence, you strip away their power. You're not giving them what they came for. You're not playing their game. You're simply observing. An observation, when rooted in calm, is power. I remember the first time I tried it. I was in a room where I'd been interrupted too many times. I'd had enough. So when it happened again, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back. I just stopped, turned, and looked. I let the silence sit there, heavy. No sarcasm, no scowl. Just the quiet message. You crossed the line. The tension became almost tangible. Everyone felt it. And the person who interrupted, he didn't know where to look. His voice faltered. He never interrupted me again. That stare said more than any words ever could, not because it was aggressive, but because it was grounded. It didn't come from anger. It came from knowing exactly who I was and that I no longer needed anyone's permission to take up space. That's the real lesson of the silent gaze. It's not about intimidation. It's about ownership. You're not trying to control them. You're showing that they no longer control you. And you're not asking for respect. You're embodying it. Quietly, clearly, without negotiation. The Stoics would call this indifference to insult. Not the kind of indifference that comes from apathy, but the kind that comes from clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. The insult only lands if you catch it. The disrespect only hurts if you let it shape your response." And when you respond with nothing, no anger, no flinch, no approval, you're letting that energy fall flat at your feet. You're not absorbing it. You're showing the other person that their behavior reflects them, not you. But more importantly, you're showing yourself that your calm is stronger than their chaos. It's not easy at first. The silence can feel awkward. You'll be tempted to fill it, to smooth things over, to speak. But resist that urge. Let the silence expand. Let it make them uncomfortable. Let them be the only one squirming. Because that discomfort, that's not yours to carry. That's theirs to face. And when you can do that, when you can master the art of the silent gaze, you'll start to feel a shift inside. You'll realize that you don't need to yell to be heard. You don't need to explain to be valid. You don't need to react to take back control. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. And in that space, you reclaim something more valuable than any comeback could ever offer. Your dignity. Part 2. Speak through silence. Say less. Mean more. There was a man I knew. Smart, thoughtful, dependable. Let's call him Matthew. He worked in an office filled with the usual noise. Deadlines, small talk, power games. He didn't chase attention, didn't care much for office politics. But there was always this one guy, charming on the outside, sharp-tongued on the inside, who had a habit of throwing barbed jokes at Matthew during meetings. The kind of jokes that make others laugh nervously and leave the target feeling just a little smaller, a little more exposed. One day, after Matthew finished presenting an idea, the guy chuckled and said, "Well, that's one way to waste the budget." Laughter followed. A few heads turned. Eyes darted. Matthew didn't laugh. He didn't frown. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, calm, looking directly at the man. 5 seconds of silence, no defense, no comeback, no reaction. The room got quieter. The man fidgeted. And then, like magic, the moment passed. The meeting moved on. That man never joked at Matthew's expense again. Most people think silence is weakness, that if you don't say something, you're surrendering. But here's the truth. Silence isn't submission. It's strategy. It's what happens when someone who knows their value decides they don't need to prove it. We live in a world addicted to reaction. Everyone's trying to get the last word, the clever comeback, the gotcha moment. But when you choose silence, when you look someone in the eye and give them absolutely nothing, you take away the very thing they came for, your energy. They came to provoke. They came to rattle you. They came to feed on your discomfort. But you gave them stillness, and that shakes them more than any insult ever could. I used to be a chronic explainer. If someone questioned me, I explained. If someone mocked me, I justified. If someone misunderstood me, I tried to make it right. And every time I did that, A little piece of me got tired. Not because I was wrong, but because I was wasting myself on people who didn't deserve my words. There is a certain kind of power that comes from saying nothing, from realizing not every battle needs your sword, from knowing that your silence can speak volumes more than your voice ever could. The Stoics understood this. Epictetus taught that we shouldn't be disturbed by the actions of others, but by our judgments about them. And Marcus Aurelius reminded us that dignity has more to do with self-restraint than with retaliation. I remember the first time I tried this consciously. I was in a room full of people who didn't respect my presence. There were side eyes, whispered sarcasm, the kind of energy that makes you want to defend your very right to exist there. But I didn't. I stood, I listened, and I gave them silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone who refuses to be touched. That moment changed everything. Not because they suddenly liked me, but because I stopped needing them to. Silence is not about letting things slide. It's about rising above them. It's about choosing peace over performance. It's a reminder that your time, your voice, your emotional bandwidth, they're not public property. They're yours, and you don't owe them to people who disrespect you. There's something disarming about a person who doesn't flinch, who doesn't chase validation, who doesn't explain their every move. That person is untouchable. And more importantly, that person is free. You see, disrespect thrives on engagement. It needs your energy to survive, like a fire needs oxygen. But when you give it nothing, when you refuse to fuel it, it chokes itself out. People who are used to provoking others don't know what to do when their words fall flat. They stumble, they backtrack, they feel exposed. And in that moment, something shifts. The power they thought they had disappears, and the control they thought they'd seized, it returns to you. You might worry that silence makes you look weak. But ask yourself this: who looks weaker? The person grasping for attention with cheap insults, or the person who knows better than to answer? The moment you stop reacting, you start reclaiming. You stop dancing to someone else's music and start walking to your own rhythm. And once you feel that calm, that clarity, it's addictive. You'll wonder why you ever gave away your voice so freely. The truth is, you don't have to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't have to defend your choices to people who've already judged you. You don't have to justify your presence in rooms you've earned your way into. Your silence is not absence. It's presence. A presence that says, I know who I am, and I don't need your approval to remain steady. So the next time someone disrespects you with a joke, a jab, or a judgment, pause. Look. Breathe. Say nothing. Let the silence stretch. Let it make them squirm. Let it remind you that you are not here to entertain disrespect. You are here to master yourself. And that's what Stoicism has always been about. Not controlling others, but controlling yourself. Not reacting to the world, but responding with wisdom. And sometimes the wisest thing you can say is nothing at all. Part 3. Own your decisions. Stop explaining yourself. He looked me dead in the eyes and asked, "Why would you leave a job like that?" I had just told him I was walking away from a six-figure position at a company most people would kill to work for. No scandals, no layoffs. I was leaving by choice. And that made people uncomfortable. They wanted a reason, a detailed roadmap, a list of pros and cons, something that would make my decision digestible to their worldview. But all I said was, because it no longer felt right. He blinked, waited for more. There was none. And in that silence, I realized something powerful. Most people don't actually want your truth. They want your compliance.
You see, we're taught early on to justify ourselves, to explain our decisions, to make people understand. From the moment we start making choices that don't fit other people's expectations, we're bombarded with questions. Why aren't you married yet? Why don't you want kids? Why did you move cities? Why'd you cut off contact with that family member? And every time we feel a little pressure to respond, to defend our logic, prove we've thought it through, convince them that we're still good, still responsible, still worthy. But here's what Stoicism teaches us. Your decisions do not require approval. Your choices, made with clarity, integrity, and personal wisdom, are valid by virtue of the fact that you made them. You do not owe the world a PowerPoint presentation for how you live your life.
The problem is, most people aren't asking because they care. They're asking because your decision threatens something in them. Your courage reminds them of their fear. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your independence challenges the comfortable little box they've built for themselves. So instead of celebrating your growth, they interrogate it. And if you keep answering, if you keep playing the game of explanation, you'll start to wonder if you really know what you're doing. That's the trap. It's subtle, but it's there. Every time you explain yourself to someone who isn't truly listening, you hand them a little piece of your confidence, and they won't give it back. I used to do this all the time. I once spent 20 minutes explaining to a distant relative why I was skipping a holiday gathering. 20 minutes justifying my need for rest, my travel schedule, my emotional bandwidth, until I realized, why am I trying so hard to be understood by someone who doesn't respect my no? Why am I bending my boundaries to appear more acceptable? And what would happen if I just said, I won't be coming this year, and left it at that? So I started practicing something I call the one-sentence rule. If someone asks about a choice I've made, I answer in one sentence. Calm, clear, no follow-up. If they ask again, I smile and change the subject. It's not rudeness, it's self-respect.
Because your life is not a courtroom. You are not on trial. And anyone who demands repeated justification for your path is not seeking connection, they're seeking control.
There's a deeper layer to this too. When you constantly explain yourself, you start internalizing the idea that your worth is up for negotiation, that your choices only matter if others agree with them, that your truth needs validation to be real. And that is the opposite of Stoic living. The Stoics believed in the sovereignty of the inner life. In Epictetus's words, no man is free who is not master of himself. And mastery begins with no longer letting the outside world dictate your steps. I once knew a woman, call her Rachel, who decided to quit law school 6 months before graduation. People went wild. Her parents panicked. Her classmates couldn't understand it. She just kept saying, "It's not my path." That's all. She didn't unpack it. She didn't entertain debate. She stood firm in her knowing. Years later, she became a wildly successful documentary filmmaker. And when people asked how she had the courage to walk away, she said, "I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't living my life." That line has stayed with me ever since. Because the truth is, no one else is waking up in your body. No one else lies awake with your regrets, carries your emotional weight, or faces your consequences. So why let their opinions drive your decisions? Why water down your instincts to make others comfortable? Now, I'm not saying never listen to feedback. Wisdom is open to perspective. But there's a difference between thoughtful reflection and compulsive justification. The first sharpens you. The second diminishes you.
The Stoic path asks you to walk your truth with quiet certainty, not because everyone agrees, but because you've done the inner work to know it's right. And here's the real kicker. The more you own your decisions without explanation, the more confident you become. Not arrogant, not defensive, just grounded. You start living less for performance, more for peace. And ironically, people begin to respect you more, not because you caved, but because you didn't. People trust those who move with conviction. Even the ones who question you at first will eventually fall silent, not because they understand, but because they see that you do. So let this be your reminder. You don't owe the world an explanation, not for your career path, your relationships, your healing process, or your silence. If it feels right in your bones, and you've weighed it with clarity, walk forward. And if someone asks why, smile gently and say, because I chose it. That's enough. Because you are enough. Part 4. Create strategic distance. Protect your peace. There was a time when I kept someone in my life long after they stopped respecting me. He was an old friend, someone I'd known for over a decade. We'd been through a lot together, and I thought that counted for something. But over time, things changed. Not in some dramatic explosion, but in slow, quiet patterns. He started making more cutting jokes about my career, my habits, even my family. He'd phrase them like humor, but the tone always landed sharp. If I pushed back, he'd say I was being too sensitive. If I let it go, it kept happening. And somewhere along the line, I realized I was bracing myself before every conversation. Not because I feared confrontation, but because I expected to be disrespected. At first, I tried all the usual things. Communicating clearly, setting boundaries, hoping he'd meet me halfway. But nothing changed. And I'll admit, it took me longer than I'm proud of to accept that it wasn't going to change. I held on to that friendship out of loyalty, out of guilt, out of fear that stepping away would make me the bad guy. But deep down, I knew if I wanted to protect my peace, I needed to create space, and so I did. Not with a grand goodbye, no fight, no drama. I just stepped back. Less phone calls, less time together, less energy spent trying to explain myself to someone who clearly wasn't listening. And here's what I learned. Not everyone deserves front row access to your life. History doesn't equal harmony. Shared memories don't guarantee shared values. And proximity should never be confused with connection. Some people drain you, not because they're evil, but because they've outgrown the part of you they used to accept. Or maybe you've grown beyond the part of you they were comfortable with. Either way, the result is the same. You leave conversations feeling smaller, and no relationship built on long-term disrespect is worth maintaining out of habit. Stoicism teaches us that peace isn't something you stumble into. It's something you cultivate. It's something you defend. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The tranquility that comes when you stop caring what they say, or think, or do. But to stop caring doesn't mean to stop feeling. It means detaching your self-worth from their behavior. And that often starts with distance." The modern world pushes the narrative that cutting people off is cold, that keeping your distance makes you selfish. But what's truly selfish is demanding someone stay emotionally accessible while repeatedly violating their boundaries. What's truly cold is expecting someone to absorb your disrespect just because you share a past. Real maturity isn't about clinging. It's about recognizing when closeness becomes corrosive, and then stepping back without bitterness. I've coached people through this, and every time the internal dialogue is the same. But they're my brother. But she was there when I needed her. But we've known each other since college. And I get it. Sentiment is strong. Shared history tugs at us. But here's a radical truth. You can love someone and still choose not to give them access to your peace.
You can care about someone's well-being and still recognize that they're not healthy for yours. You can release someone with grace, not resentment.
And the moment you do, something incredible happens. You breathe easier. You think clearer. You stop rehearsing arguments in your head. You stop monitoring your words out of fear they'll twist them. That extra space gives you something you didn't realize you were missing: yourself. The version of you that isn't constantly on defense. The version that doesn't shrink to avoid being targeted. That version, that's who you were always meant to be. I remember the day I knew I'd made the right call. It was a quiet Saturday. I hadn't heard from that old friend in a while, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel a low-grade anxiety buzzing in the background. No tension, no dread, just peace. I sat there, drinking my coffee, and thought, this is what life feels like when you stop letting people rent space in your mind for free. Now, I'm not suggesting you cut ties with everyone who annoys you. Relationships take work, misunderstandings happen. But there's a difference between a rough patch and a pattern. And when someone consistently disrespects you, ignores your boundaries, or dismisses your voice, it's not your job to fix them. It's your job to protect you. There's a quiet dignity in strategic distance. It doesn't scream, it doesn't rage, it just steps back. And that act alone says, I value myself too much to stay where I'm constantly questioned. It's not about revenge, it's about returning to your inner calm, your clarity, your center. So if someone in your life consistently makes you feel unheard, unseen, or unworthy, ask yourself, am I keeping them close out of love or out of guilt? And more importantly, what would my life feel like without this constant tension? Because the answer to that question might just be the beginning of a peace you didn't know you were allowed to claim. You don't owe anyone unlimited access to your spirit. Friendship, family, partnership, they are sacred, but they are not entitled. Respect is the price of admission. And if someone won't pay that price, you are free to close the gate. Let them say what they will. Let them call you cold. Let them play the victim. Let them spin whatever story helps them sleep at night. You are not responsible for how they interpret your peace. You are only responsible for how well you protect it. And when you choose distance, not out of hate, but out of clarity, you are practicing one of the highest forms of Stoic strength. You are saying, I don't need to control you. I just refuse to keep losing myself around you. And that is where peace begins. Part 5. Walk with unshakable presence. Head high, eyes forward. He smirked when I walked in. Not the kind of smirk that says, I'm glad you're here, but the kind that slices, barely noticeable to others, but loud and clear if you've been on the receiving end before. I knew that look. He had made a habit of it. Always a joke just under his breath when I spoke up. Always a subtle eye roll when I had an idea. Always something. That day I said nothing. I just walked in, shoulders back, chin level, calm in my step. And when he tried his usual comment, I looked him dead in the eye, let it roll past me like wind, and kept speaking as if his words didn't even register. And the truth is, they didn't. You see, when people try to make you small, they're not always loud about it. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's disguised as teasing. Sometimes it shows up in the way they don't look at you when you speak, or the way they pretend not to hear your input in a group. But the intent is the same. Shake your sense of self. Pull your confidence down just enough so theirs feels bigger. And the most powerful response? Don't let it reach you. There's a reason the Stoics talked so much about posture, not just of the body, but of the soul. Marcus Aurelius once wrote,
Dwell on the beauty of life. Watch the stars and see yourself running with them. There's no mention of shrinking in that line. No apology, just motion, just magnitude. To walk with your head high is not arrogance. It's a declaration. I belong here. I don't need to prove anything to anyone who hasn't earned the right to question me. But let's be honest, it's not always easy. Some of us have been trained, through years of subtle rejection, judgment, or criticism, to walk softly, to avoid eye contact, to hunch ourselves smaller. We slouch not just with our bodies, but with our spirit. We get in the habit of shrinking before we've even assessed if danger is present. And every time we do that, we reinforce the lie that we are less than, that we must contort to make others feel more comfortable. But you don't have to do that anymore. You never did. True confidence doesn't shout. It doesn't need a stage or applause. It just shows up. Calm, grounded, present. And the amazing thing is, when you start embodying that, shoulders back, breath steady, head high, you don't just feel different. You are different. Something shifts internally. You stop seeking permission. You stop scanning the room for cues to speak. You stop asking silently, "Is it okay for me to take up space here?" And start answering with your presence, "I already do." I remember a woman I coached years ago. Brilliant, well-read, deeply thoughtful. But every time she entered a room, she'd fold in on herself, sit at the edge of the seat, speak in disclaimers. And she couldn't figure out why people kept overlooking her. We worked on nothing but presence for months. Not voice, not words, just presence. One day, she told me something that gave me chills. She said, "I walked into a meeting yesterday and didn't change who I was to make them comfortable. And for the first time, they listened." It wasn't that she got louder. It's that she finally stopped hiding. Confidence doesn't come from dominating a room. It comes from not needing to. When someone disrespects you, and you meet it not with fire, not with fear, but with stillness and posture, you're showing them and yourself that you are above whatever game they're trying to play. It doesn't mean the insult doesn't land. It means it doesn't linger. It passes through because it finds no place to attach. There's a quiet sort of intimidation in that. People who rely on making others feel small don't know what to do when their target won't shrink. And let's be clear, they may try harder at first. They may throw more shade, get louder, make bigger moves. But if you remain unmoved, if you keep showing up with that still, grounded presence, they eventually stop. Not because they learned respect, but because they realized you're not someone they can rattle. And when they do stop, you keep going. Because this path you're walking isn't about them. It never was. Holding your head high is for you. It's a daily reminder that your value is not up for debate, that you are not someone who disappears when challenged, that you do not need to prove what's already true. And here's something I've noticed. When you start walking this way, when you stop letting disrespect bend your spine or lower your gaze, something else happens. People begin to mirror you. Your presence changes the room. Others stand a little taller around you. Speak with a little more care. Not because you demanded it, but because you modeled it. And that's the quiet power of the Stoic path. It doesn't shout, it influences. So next time you enter a space where you felt overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated, pause. Breathe. Straighten your posture. Feel your feet grounded beneath you. Lift your head, not in defiance, but in dignity. And when the same old voices try the same old tactics, don't fight them. Don't sink to meet them. Rise. Because the truth is, you don't owe them anything. Not your reaction, not your explanation.
Head high, eyes forward, keep walking.
Part 6. Set the standard. Lead with self-respect. At some point, you stop trying to correct people and start correcting the environment you allow around you. That moment doesn't usually come with fireworks or grand realizations. It often arrives quietly, after one too many eye rolls, after one too many sarcastic jokes disguised as just kidding, after one too many times you walk away from a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered. And in that quiet, something shifts. You realize, I've been waiting for people to change, when I should have been changing the rules of access to me.
You see, the way people treat you doesn't just reflect who they are. It reflects what you've taught them is acceptable. That's a hard truth. But it's also liberating. Because it means you have more power than you think. Not the power to control others, but the power to set the tone. To decide what you tolerate, what you ignore, and what you allow to continue in your presence. That's what Stoicism was always about. Not building walls, but building standards. The Stoics weren't passive. They didn't float through life smiling at rudeness or pretending that injustice didn't sting. What they practiced was sovereignty, the unwavering belief that your inner peace is your responsibility, and your outer world must align with it, not the other way around. And from that belief, they acted accordingly. They weren't afraid to walk away, to say less, to live quietly and firmly within the values they chose. And that's what you must do too. Choose your standard, and then live it, unapologetically.
I remember a woman who told me once, "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just not available to disrespect." That line stayed with me, not because of how sharp it sounded, but because of how peaceful she was when she said it. She had reached that place not by fighting with everyone who crossed her boundaries, but by letting them fall away naturally. Not with cruelty, with clarity. And when people saw that they couldn't get the same reaction from her, when they realized the old games didn't work, they stopped playing. Or they disappeared. Either way, peace returned. You're not here to train people how to respect you through arguments and lectures. You're here to model what self-respect looks like, and let the world respond accordingly. The people who see you clearly will rise to meet you. The ones who don't, they'll drift. And that's not rejection, that's refinement. You're curating the environment your soul lives in. You're filtering out the noise, not with confrontation, but with consistency. And let's be honest, it takes work. You'll feel guilty at first, you'll second guess yourself. You'll wonder if you're being too harsh, too sensitive, too distant. People might even accuse you of changing. And they'll be right, you are changing. From someone who tolerated too much to someone who finally decided enough. That's not selfish. That's sacred. That's what evolution looks like. You cannot force others to see your worth, but you can refuse to stand in places where it's ignored. You cannot make someone respect you, but you can make it very clear that without respect, they don't get access to you. You cannot rewrite someone else's character, but you can control your proximity to it. This is the highest form of Stoic strength. Not silence for silence's sake, not distance out of coldness, but the deliberate shaping of a life where your peace is protected, your energy is directed, and your presence is earned. And that becomes your message to the world. Not through slogans, not through speeches, but through how you carry your... That's how you set the standard. You live it, you become it, and everything that can't meet it simply fades. So if you've ever wondered how to deal with people who don't respect you, maybe the better question is, how much longer will I allow disrespect to sit at my table? Because the moment you walk with self-respect, the moment you lead with it, not only do the wrong people disappear, the right ones start to notice. Respect starts with you. The standard is set by you. And the world rises or falls according to what you allow. So hold the line. Live the standard and let your self-respect do all the talking.